Hi everyone. Welcome to today's IMIM seminar. We are delighted to have you all here. It's our pleasure to host Haonan Zhou as today's speaker. Haonan earned his PhD from Princeton University in 2024 and has joined the University of Hong Kong as an assistant professor of finance. His research explores key areas in international macro and finance, including exchange rate dynamics, emerging market business cycles, and global capital allocation. Today, Holland will present his paper titled Anatomy of a Treasury Market Who Moves Yields. This is a timely and important contribution to the ongoing discussion about structure and drivers of the US Treasury market. So we are fortunate to have Professor Zhenyang Jiang serving as today's discussant. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Holland.
All right, thanks a lot, Ren. This is thanks for having me here, and thanks for a very generous introduction, both myself and this paper. So so this paper is joined with Manav Chowdhury, who's going to LSE, and Zhi who's a Washi Olane. As you can see from the title, we're interested in thinking about how to think about pricing of the treasury market. In particular, we're looking at the pricing of US treasury notes and bonds. So, at this point, it doesn't really need a lot of motivation to illustrate the importance of this question, especially given what has been going on over the past week, and especially over the past 2 or 3 days, where basically the headlines is all about like how exactly the US Treasury 10-year yield moved by like 50, 60 basis points. And there are like just a bunch of discussion about who are selling, who are buying, and for what reason certain actors are doing this or that. But at the end of the day, this gives this is essentially indicating that we really have in our mind some sort of clear connection between changes in investor demand versus changes in treasury prices. So at least from either from the academics or the industry people, we do have a sense that there is a clear connection between quantities and prices, but it's not super clear, at least from the literature, that to what extent can we quantify or relatively precisely characterize the role of different types of investors in driving treasury yields, and also to what extent there are structural transformations in the treasury market that changes these different role played by different investors over time. So essentially, this paper tries to offer a framework to think about this. And just if you want to sort of think about the broad picture aspect of things, thinking about usually how should we approach the problem of characterizing treasury yields, we typically think about two different types of approaches. In general, we want to potentially write down a term structure model with several macro factors that basically underpins a stochastic discount factor, which in turn is going to price the treasuries. But these type of models are by design are relatively silent in terms of characterizing the heterogeneities. To what extent China are different from, let's say, US mutual funds or US banks in terms of driving treasury yields. So this is something that usual standard term structure model is a little bit difficult to answer. And there are also papers, especially on the empirical front, trying to zoom in to specific investors. Let's say characterizing the role of the Fed in terms of moving treasury yields, characterizing the role of foreigners in terms of moving treasury yields over time. But to the extent that we know that the treasury yields is a highly endogenous object, which is determined in turn by the interaction of demand and supply coming from a variety of different players. But only zooming in on specific investors is not going to give you a lot of mileage in terms of thinking about counterfactuals or thinking about the entire the aggregate market essentially. So what we did in this paper is to try to at least provide an attempt to try to provide a unified framework of treasury price in connection with demand coming from heterogeneous investors. And essentially, this is what we do. So we provide a framework that's based on equilibrium. So you can think of this as a sort of partial equilibrium model for the US Treasury market. And the gist of the model is just that we start off using a relatively simple characterization. Everything is linear, so the investors' demand is a linear function of prices and demand shifters, as well as idiosyncratic shocks. But we leave a lot of the parameters very flexibly specified, so that we can actually offer a rather parsimonious, easy to estimate, yet very flexible approach to model different players' dynamics jointly. And then because we are working under an equilibrium framework, the benefit is that we can actually try to decompose the aggregate changes in yield into components contributed by macro factors or components contributed by specific investors. So we can very precisely tell you, for instance, over 2003 to 2008, to what extent did China's demand for US Treasury move Treasury yields? So this is something that we can very clearly tell you. And also, once we estimate these kind of models, we can potentially provide some insights into the so-called macro structure or the aggregate workings of the Treasury market. So we can answer questions such as, how liquid is the Treasury market? If I throw in $100 billion into the market from other market, what is going to be the price impact? And who are the guys that are actually actively stepping in to provide market liquidity when Treasury price drops, right? And then also our flexibility of our system is able to help us answer questions such as structural transformations. We can have a sense of how the Treasury market ecosystem are evolving before and after the global financial crisis. And finally, we can zoom into specific investors under this equilibrium framework and provide some answers to, for instance, why do treasuries appreciate during bad times? Who are the guys that are flying to safety? We think that these type of questions are also quite important because it sort of informs how we should write down a standard models that incorporate these type of features from a theory standpoint. All right. So let me just very quickly preview our main findings. So essentially, we make three main points. And the first point is just to try to give you a sense of how liquid is the market, how large is the aggregate so-called macro multiplier or the aggregate price elasticities associated with the market. So our estimate essentially suggests that the market for US Treasury is not as elastic as you would have imagined from just looking at canonical models. And in particular, the macro multiplier is to the order of 1. So just to unpack this number a little bit. So this is basically saying that if I have 1% increase in demand, or there's a 1% demand shock as a share of the market, which you can roughly think of it on average across our sample period, which is 2003 to 2023, it's going to be around $100 billion. And our estimate is going to suggest that for a market portfolio of US Treasury notes and bonds, it's going to result in 1% increase in prices, or equivalently, if you convert it back to the yields using durations of the average portfolio, it's going to be implying that if you throw in $100 billion into the market, it's going to compress Treasury yields on average by 15 basis points. All right. I just want to say up front that this is although we find that in general it's an inelastic market from a classical model standpoint, it's the Treasury market still seems if you place our estimate into the literature, it's still relatively more liquid compared to markets such as the corporate bond market or the equity market. So this is still a relatively, if it may involve functioning market in terms of absorbing investor demand shocks. All right. So once we have this estimate, we can zoom in into different types of heterogeneities. And in particular, we show that there is a large degree of heterogeneities on investors' sensitivity to price changes in this market across different types of investors, but also across time. So we can say something about the changing nature of liquidity provision. Some investors are providing liquidity before the financial crisis, but their liquidity provision capacity seems to sort of go down after the global financial crisis. And some other investors, which are essentially the Fed, kind of rises in terms of their role in terms of providing liquidity into the market. And the second thing that we can do in this paper is to decompose using our equilibrium framework of quarterly changes in yield into investor-specific drivers. So we can be very clear about the structural changes associated with Great Recession, so that we're going to show you that foreign investors in particular, they used to play a big role in terms of compressing treasury yields, so it can sort of explain some of the puzzles related to monetary policy and long-term rates before the global financial crisis. But now their role in terms of changing yields are diminishing, and now the Fed has stepped in as an important player in this market. And finally, we zoom into flight to safety episodes, and we make the point associated with our estimate that it's the domestic players, for instance, domestic households, that are contributing most to the compression of yields, especially during episodes in which VIX shoots up. There is some sort of so-called flight to safety kind of event. So our story is basically based on whether the domestic investors are potentially more likely to fly to quality, while foreign investors actually potentially use treasuries as a hedge, so that during bad times when treasury appreciates, they may be able to rebalance and sell and essentially realize its hedging value. All right, so this is basically the gist of the paper. So let me just very quickly sort of place our paper into the literature. So as I mentioned when I was doing the introduction.
Can I ask a couple of questions?
Yes, Jen.
So here, you mostly focus on the demand side. So how about the supply side? So
Yes, so we are also going to have something to say about the supply side, because as you see later, our demand system is actually a demand supply system, so that we can actually also explicitly model how the treasury is responding to prices, overall prices in the treasury notes and bonds market. And our estimate is essentially that the price elasticity of supply associated with the issuer is essentially zero. So they're not responding from an aggregate treasury market standpoint to changes in the price of the market portfolio. So our model, this is actually a good segue for me to just make a slight disclaimer, which is that you shouldn't think of our model as basically a good model for thinking about yield curve substitution, the shifting yield curve, or like basically whether the treasury should issue a little bit more medium-term bonds versus like long-term bonds. So this is something that potentially it's not something that our model is able to inform, but our model is a little bit better in terms of characterizing like to what extent from a macro standpoint the treasury is responding to prices. And our answer is essentially no, they are not responding to prices.
okay, thank you.
Do you have any other questions? I thought you had multiple questions.
Oh, another thing I was thinking about is you have documented some very interesting facts, but for example, like the before financial crisis and after financial crisis, the driver of the yields could be different. So, and then what do you think that have caused this to happen? What
Yeah,
is the cause
So
for
this
this?
is definitely a good question. So our paper is mostly on the estimation front. We in the paper try to provide a little bit of more discussion on the actual mechanism. For instance, we find that there is a diminishing role of U.S. banks and the banking institution in terms of their sensitivity of demand to price changes, and we interpret this as being associated with, for instance, post-crisis financial regulations that essentially force them to sort of inelastically hold a bunch of treasuries on their balance sheet. But also, for instance, some of the accounting treatments, held to maturity accounting, but also some sort of and also some of the post-COVID situation is also going to contribute a little bit. So The thing I can say from a broad standpoint about this paper is that in order to think a little bit deeper on the potential mechanisms, we essentially delegated to the literature. So for instance, the role of the U.S. banks after the crisis, it has been documented by a bunch of people in the literature. So here we're just basically you can also think of this paper as basically writing a note to those papers that are paying a little bit more attention to a specific economic mechanism. And our point is that okay, so you can have a multiple mechanism at work, but what ultimately matters for treasury pricing is to what extent they are willing to supply liquidity, and this is captured by our price elasticity estimate.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. These are great questions. And so I just want to mention on going back to positioning of the literature. So as a
Sorry, one quick question.
yes.
How should I think about default risk of the US here? Is it going to be like just a common factor shock or something like that?
Yeah, so basically when we were writing this paper, we're sort of in the camp that default risk is not necessarily an issue for US Treasury. So we sort of abstract away from later you'll see that when we add demand shifters into the picture, we kind of abstracted away from default risk. But
Okay.
whatever has been happening over the past 2 or 3 days probably is going to mandate us to add a robustness check on to what extent these defaults are actually priced in. So what I remember when I look at the data was basically if you recall the 2011 episodes in which a bunch of credit rating agencies actually downgraded the U.S. Treasury because of some budget impasse, and this actually didn't show up in Treasury prices. So that's my recollection. So probably like 10 years ago, it's probably not too much of a problem, but now it looks like it's probably a problem. So I should give a look at that. For sure.
Yeah. I mean the framework per se doesn't really rule out default risk, right? So
For
I'm just
sure,
trying
no,
to
yeah.
I'm just trying to understand if you can.
Yeah. So we essentially the framework allows the forest to enter into the demand function of the investors as an additional demand shifter. That's essentially.
Okay.
So going back to the literature, as I mentioned, there are a bunch of literature talking about specific investors, the role of foreign investors, the QE, and the Fed driving treasury yields. And our contribution is essentially that we can basically speak to this literature using one encompassing framework that is based on equilibrium, that's based on market clearing. So we can essentially try to take care of, for instance, some of the missing intercept problem that these type of empirical literature is not very well equipped to handle. Of course, we speak to the pricing literature in general, which is dominated mostly by the term structure papers. And we, of course, we speak to the literature on demand-based asset pricing model. For instance, some of the pioneering work done by Zhou and Ralph Kozin and some of my co-authors as well. But there is one particular paper by Christie, Van Hao, and Lucas, which also looks at the U.S. government bond market, the U.S. Treasury market, but they approach this problem from more like a yield curve substitution standpoint. So their model of a preferred habitat investor is such that they can go very deep into the substitution between medium-term bonds versus long-term bonds. And our paper is more towards the line of the entire market. We look at how the inelasticity of the entire market and also how the market, the evolution of the elasticities of the market is going to help us speak to several facts related to the treasury markets. All right.
And sorry, just one quick follow-up. I mean
Yes.
So what we have in the past week was tariff.
Yeah.
I mean before the tariff reduction, a very high tariff. Suppose all the investor or suppose everyone believe that is going to able to close the US trade deficit.
Mhm.
And the mirror image of that would be substantially reduced flow to treasury market. I mean,
Yeah.
not just treasury, but and then based on the elasticity that you were talking about, like about one, there will be a reduction in the quantity and also increase in yield as well, right?
Yeah. So by the end
It's
of
not, yeah,
yeah.
it's not like like it's, I don't know, like the yield increase in the past few days. It's not like a crazy thing that would have
Yeah, yeah, I
from
totally
the
agree. Steve,
yeah.
I think you're hitting the jackpot here. So by the end of my presentation, hopefully, I will get to a particular scenario where we can actually say something about, which is, what if China just sells off its entire treasury portfolio, and we can have a number on this. And the number,
Okay.
just to sort of very vaguely preview this, it's not super different from what we have witnessed over the past 2 or 3 days in terms of the actual basis point responses. But of course, we know that there is more to this during the past 2 or 3 days in terms of the financial plumbing aspect of things for the treasury market. But we can make a prediction on this, and later you'll see how crazy or how not crazy this number looks like.
Just one more question on China. I
Yeah.
think. I mean, the system is linear, so
Yes.
China complete sell off is not like it's sort of like a big shock in the system that you don't want to.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Okay.
true.
Okay.
That's definitely true. So, basically, our standpoint is essentially that it sort of depends on how big or how large you think
Mm-hmm.
China is at this point. It
Yeah.
it, it was a little bit surprising to us, but in terms of
Mm.
China's market share at this point for the entire U.S. Treasury bonds and notes market, if you exclude Belgium, which is some people would say that this is one of the custodians of China, but if you just
Mm.
focus on China's holding reported in the TIC data, the actual market share is around like 3.5%. So it's not that big if you think about like a scenario of China completely selling off its treasury portfolio. But
I
we can
see.
we can talk about how large or how small are these kind of linearization kind of procedure allow us to.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. These are great questions. So I have around 30 minutes, so I'll just very quickly go through our model framework. I want to sort of also highlight a little bit in terms of our innovation relative to the literature on how we identify the parameters of the system, and in particular, the elasticity of demand with respect to prices, which is essentially a very sort of a very difficult to estimate object on its own. And then we can go to some of our findings about the market as a whole, and also about specific episodes and specific players. Right. So this is just to set the stage a little bit in terms of what you expect our main environment looks like. So this is our data. Our data is going to be based on financial accounts, so sector level holdings plus country level holdings of treasuries collected from Treasury International Capital System, plus individual bank holdings collected from call reports. So you can see that all of these are publicly available data. And so if you look at the evolution of the treasury holdings and the investor base of the treasury bonds and notes market, which are bonds with an original maturity larger than a year, then you see that it used to be that foreign investors hold a relatively large share of the market, and then their role tend to sort of diminish a little bit, and instead the Fed, because of their QE operations and their emergency asset purchase operation, this seems to claim a larger territory. But also there's the role played by certain U.S. financial institutions and other type of investors that are not characterized as U.S. financial institutions in the flow of funds data. But overall, just to give you a sort of a sense of how large are the shocks that we're talking about, a 1% demand shock in this particular environment roughly corresponds to $100 billion if you take the average of the market size from 2003 to 2023, which is our sample period. And we are looking at quarterly fluctuations of treasury demand and treasury prices. And if you think about it, so I mentioned that we do want a framework to be as flexible as possible, as capturing as much of a heterogeneity as possible. But if you think about it, even writing down like a relatively full-fledged model that takes into account all sorts of diverse set of investors and their institutional features and constraints are extremely difficult, right? So you have to be very clear in terms of what are the objectives of these investors. Some investors might be just arbitrageurs. They have mean variance utility. They can access all markets. Some investors may just feel like a life insurer who tend to want to sort of do some duration matching, and they just want to make sure that the life insurance premium that they collected can be invested in some safe asset. So, different investors may derive different utilities from these from holdings of treasuries, and they also may be subject to different types of constraints or investment mandates. So making these modeling in very much in detail these investors problem rather difficult, right? And I'm not even talking about like different types of constraints, regulatory constraints, benchmark value, risk, all these sorts of different types of stuff that is potentially going to matter when we think about modeling investor behavior. But here, in order to make things empirically tractable, our observation is essentially that everything essentially can be encompassed by basically modeling investor demand as a function, potentially nonlinear function of prices and certain type of demand shifter, right? You could think of these demand shifter as basically some bonds and utility parameters, some endogenous type of constraints or stuff like this. And basically, once you get these demand functions, Q as a function of P and some these demand shifters, then you can think about linearizing those. And we are going to work extensively with this linearized system, essentially relating changes in flow to changes in prices and some sort of demand shifter in a linear framework. And one thing that I should mention is that we do this linearization around a steady state, around some sort of long run steady state. So later, when you see that we aggregate things up using size, we are going to be able to accommodate a constant size, which is going to be very convenient for our estimation. All right. But essentially, the demand function of investors that we're going to estimate is going to be changes in quantities demanded or flow as a linear function of changes in prices of a market portfolio of treasuries plus certain demand shifter. And here, as you can see, one of the most important parameter is going to be these elasticities. And these, in particular, these elasticities with respect to prices. All right. And we can, for the sake of empirical clarity, we can even decompose these demand shifters in more detail. We can express these demand shifters as a linear function of some common factors that all investors take account of and load on, and also some idiosyncratic shocks associated with specific types of investors. For instance, you can think of these idiosyncratic shocks as something like a mutual fund holding a treasury bond suddenly receives some sort of inflows for no reason or for reasons that are orthogonal to some macroeconomic environment, right? So, for instance, if you think about the common factors, we should be able to imagine that some macro financial factors, some policy factors, and expectations factors could drive treasury demand as a separate demand shifter, shifting the levels of these treasury demand curve, right? And in that sense, we're a little bit closer to the term structure literature. Instead of modeling SDF as a function of factors, we're now explicitly modeling quantity demanded as a function of factors. Right. You could also accommodate unobservable factors. You could think that there is something that are unobservable to the econometrician, but there could be some hidden factor structure that affects these different quantities demanded by different investors collectively. In that sense, we're going to use some principal components analysis, extracting principal components from residual flows to account for this. And finally, as I mentioned, idiosyncratic investor-specific shocks are also going to be important potentially in driving quantities and eventually driving prices. So you could think of this as idiosyncratic fund flows, some sort of idiosyncratic changes in the regulatory framework for a particular sector of investors, or some private information associated with investors. Potentially, if you believe in the information effects of the Fed, then you could think of these idiosyncratic demand shock associated with the Fed as representing some private information. All right. So these are the framework. So it's incredibly simple and hopefully clear. And we are going to apply market clearing, because once we write down each individual investor's demand curve, we'll be able to say that impose some sort of market clearing condition to arrive at an equilibrium and an asset pricing equation. So the market clearing condition is rather simple. It's basically dictating that the total change in flows, including supply, which we are going to model as a negative flow, is going to be 0. And you can see here that because we do linearization with respect to long-run market share, so we can actually use this long-run market holding share as the weight when we do this aggregation. And then once we impose these market clearing conditions, then we can rearrange the system such that we ended up getting an asset pricing equation. We can relate changes in prices to demand shifters, both the idiosyncratic shocks and the common factors. All right. And there are going to be the impact of these demand shifters with certain kind of loadings lambda on these common factors is going to be scaled by the so-called market multiplier, this reciprocal of zeta S, which is going to aggregate each investor's price elasticity of demand. Okay. So these are our asset pricing equation. And one benefit of having this equation using this equilibrium system is we can exactly 100% decompose observed changes in treasury yield into specific components that are accounted for by different investors. And the way that we do this is very much in line with the spirit of several papers by Zhou Yang, which is basically iteratively deleting one type of investors and computing so-called counterfactual prices, and so that we can basically back out the contribution of these investors by computing the differences between these prices. Right. And,
hi, hold on. Can I ask you a question? So
yes,
I'm wondering, like, how do you think about this, like, nonlinear relationship between the those latent variables with the treasury? For example, this really depends on whether the treasury is a risk on or risk off assets. For example, right now, like from past week, a lot of whatever you estimate here, the sign can be different.
Yeah, exactly. So I see your questions basically thinking about two potential things. So one is basically some sort of state dependence on, for instance, the price elasticities parameters. So for instance, you could think of price elasticities as potentially a function of the demand shifters, right? So in our baseline framework, we are sort of abstracting away from this, mostly because it becomes a little bit difficult to estimate these kind of potential state dependence. But we did some attempts. For instance, we can allow these demand elasticities to depend on VIX. And although our estimation is a little bit imprecise on that front, we do find that the price elasticity seems to go down when VIX goes up. So this you can think of this as is either indicating some sort of risk aversion, amplifying risk aversion, or some sort of constrained tightening kind of stuff that's showing up in the function of the market. And so another way to think about this is potentially that to capture this nonlinearity is that we are able to speak to, for instance, time variation in these price elasticities by just basically assuming some sort of different regimes. Although this is not like a fully nonlinear estimation attempt, it does allows us to say something about what's different before 2008 and what's different after 2008. So yeah, this is basically where we're at this point. But hopefully we can say something more once we have the new version. We can try to do a little bit more on the interaction kind of front. All right. So let me quickly go to the estimation, because I don't think we have a lot of time to, but I do want to show you some results. So basically the identification challenge is that we have this classic joint determination problem or like or simultaneity problem, that changes in quantities are and changes in prices are both endogenous. And in order to estimate these, we need some exogenous variations. And you can think of these exogenous variations typically representing some sort of residual supply curve shifts. So I'm an investor A, and I need to use some idiosyncratic demand shock coming from investor B to help me identify investor A's demand elasticities. But in this particular case, because we want to make sure that we sort of accommodate all sorts of heterogeneities across different sectors of different investors, we do need a lot of instruments. And typical way of approaching this problem might not work relatively well from a statistical power kind of sense, or even from an economic standpoint. So we need multi-period instrument for all investors or all sectors. So typically used event studies or industry-specific instruments do not typically work. So our innovation here is to try to utilize this idea that because we have a model, we can extract the idiosyncratic shocks and use these idiosyncratic shocks for all the investors other than the investors that we are interested in to instrument for price to estimate the investors' demand that we are interested in. So in particular, we're going to impose this identifying assumption that across investors in different sectors, the idiosyncratic shifters are independent. So you could think of this as basically reflecting some sort of granular IV type of assumption. But intuitively, you should think of this as basically whatever happens that is exclusively in China is China's idiosyncratic shock. And to the extent that information are relatively rigid, we don't expect that these other type of investors can fully and consistently exploit information that are associated with whatever idiosyncratic shock that is coming from China or that's coming from like an individual mutual funds like PIMCO. So this is basically the identifying assumptions here. Chang.
Oh yeah, I have a question. Hi, Haonan. So just want to clarifying question. So the I here is like a sector, right? So it's either FAD, it's financial
Yeah.
institution,
So when we do the
then.
estimation, when we do the estimation, IJ are sectors. But my favorite way of interpreting these identifying assumption is from the standpoint of individual investors. So one mutual fund doesn't care about the demand shock coming from one pension fund. And because we are working with a linear model, you can sort of aggregating all idiosyncratic shocks associated with investors in a particular sector, and these identifying assumptions is still going to hold at the sector level, provided that we have some sort of granularity within sectors. So if we have sort of some sort of factor distribution of sizes associated with a specific sector, let's say we have 600 mutual funds, and some of them are especially large. So these type of identifying assumptions is still going to work.
Yeah, I'm not questioning the identifying assumption. Okay,
Yeah.
just based on my understanding of GIV, I think like it only works great if you have a very concentrated sector, right?
Yes, so this is where our paper differs from the usual GIV approach.
Yeah, but maybe I'm getting confused. If I look at your figure one, it's just, you know, the four players in the market, they're pretty
Yeah, they're not super different, right? So
I see. Okay, I see your point.
Yeah.
It's other so you basically just use this four of them. I see.
No, not really. So I should clarify that when we are estimating things, we use a large number of sectors. So first, we interpret individual countries as sectors. So China is a sector, and Japan is another sector, and U.S. mutual funds is another sector. So we are able to sort of break things to a little bit more detail. So it's a little bit less convincing that, you know, if you aggregate things to a really aggregated level, let's say U.S. banks versus U.S. non-banks, these kind of identifying assumptions potentially a little bit less tenable, but we are able to sort of break things into a more granular kind of level. And one thing I should note is basically that our method, for reasons I don't have time to talk about, does not require that there is going to be some relatively concentrated, large concentration of one particular sectors. All we need is basically, essentially the methodology is still going through, even if we have an equal weight. So everybody has the same size. We can still use this kind of methodology. So in some sense, this is granular instrumental variables, but we can throw away the granular part of it. Right? So, and I do want to speed things up a little bit, just to mention that this identifying assumption, we can operationalize it using GMM. So once we use GMM, we can estimate this entire system. But paying attention to the fact that this is an over-identifying system, so we want to use some optimal estimator to sort of weigh these moment conditions to arrive at the most crisp estimator ever. And essentially we did, by utilizing the economics associated with our system, we use size weighting, so that essentially applying some sort of market clearing type of logic. So we can very clearly interpret our IVs. So essentially the GMM, the procedure that we use, essentially extracts idiosyncratic shocks, and our size weighting is going to fully use other investors' idiosyncratic shocks to instrument the prices. Or you can also think of this in another way, which is that our estimator of the price elasticities is going to have this rather clear bias correction interpretation. So when individual investor size are going to 0, then you can essentially consistently recover their price elasticity by running an OLS regression. The intuition is that their trades are not going to affect prices endogenously. But here now, our estimation is going to tell you that, okay, so the larger is the size and the demand shocks associated with an investor, the stronger is going to be the bias associated with the OLS estimation, for which our GMM-based estimation is going to be able to correct for. All right. So let me just very quickly go through some of the main results that we have. So one is to quantify the aggregate elasticities, which is to the order of 1, which translated to yield term, basically, if you're throwing $100 billion US into the market, you're going to result in a 15 basis point compression of yields with an average market duration of, let's say, 6.5 years. And as I mentioned, this is a relatively lower estimate compared to some of the existing literature talking about corporate bond market or the equity market or the FX market, for which people here have a bunch of contributions. So it's an inelastic market from the standpoint of CASA models, from the standpoint of micro bond substitution, but it's a rather elastic market when you compare this with other type of market from an aggregate or macro standpoint. And I mentioned that there is a large degree of heterogeneity across households. So the most elastic sectors are U.S. households, Federal Reserve. The rest of the world investors are in general relatively less elastic, but they are quite large. And then also some of the contributors to a relatively large price elasticity are including U.S. banks. But as I mentioned earlier, responding to Ren's question, supply elasticity is very much close to 0. And other investors like pension funds, they are also quite inelastic when it comes to their treasury demand. All right. So now that I tell you a little bit of about our baseline estimate, let me just very quickly go through some of our main findings, focusing on specific episodes or evolutions. All right. So the first thing I want to show you is just that we can utilize the flexibility of the system to break down our elasticity estimate to different regimes. And in particular, we can show that for foreign investors and for US banks, the price elasticities essentially halved once we move to the post-crisis regime. All right. So this indicates that these investors are not going to be the most significant investor when it comes to liquidity provision when there is a treasury price drop. They're not as nimble to step in compared to the pre-crisis episodes. And we have discussed a number of reasons for which this could potentially happen. Another thing that we can do utilizing our equilibrium framework is that we can do a quarter-by-quarter decomposition of the contribution of different types of investors to the compression or the amplification of treasury yield gaps. All right. So as you can see, for the sake of clarity, we sort of combine it into specific episodes, and you can very clearly see that before the crisis, there is a sense that rest of the world investors are the most significant compressor of treasury yields. So on average per quarter, their contribution to the yield compression is around 0.4 percentage points. But after 2015, their role in terms of compressing yields substantially declined. Right? Instead, as you can see, the Fed has been stepping in. And in particular, the Fed is not only becoming more price elastic, but they're also very elastically responding to, let's say, changes in VIX. So this 1.55 is the factor elasticity of Fed's demand associated with a rise in the VIX index. All right, so essentially during market stresses, for instance, during the COVID years, they are able to step into the market. And over the entire year, our estimate is that the Fed's purchasing helps compressing treasury yields overall by 2 percentage points. Finally, very quickly, we want to look at fractal safety episodes because it informs us about how to best write down a model of, let's say, convenience yields or dollar shocks, and which is gaining traction in these international macro literature. What we find is essentially that if you look at the rest of the world's demand loadings on VIX, it's a negative number instead of a positive number. So on average, there's not a lot of significant evidence to claim that foreign investors are the main guys that flies to safety. But you can see that a lot of the contributors are US households. But by US households, that essentially mean US hedge funds or US family offices that are outside of the purview of the traditional flow of funds account. Right? So the bottom line here is that it looks like the foreigners' behavior are consistent with using treasuries as a hedge, but rather it's the domestic investors that exhibit the strongest degree of flight to quality. I'm just going to conclude my presentation by just showing you two pictures. So one picture is that these foreign investors' demand is very clearly illustrated from the standpoint of using some scatter plots. For instance, essentially the point here is that when you think about relating investors' demand to, let's say, cyclical factors, let's say the VIX, it's not necessarily sufficient to just basically regress changes in quantities on changes in VIX. You need to take into account the fact that the quantities that you observed are equilibrium objects. You need to take care of the so-called missing intercept problem by essentially adjusting for other investors' potential responses to the same risk factors as well. So here we're showing you the scatter plots basically relating changes in VIX index on the x-axis versus the inflows into the treasury market, but adjusted by the overall changes in treasury supplies over each quarter on the left-hand side and over the global financial crisis episodes on a month-to-month basis. And once we take into account the fact that there is a large influx of new treasury issuance during particular period of VIX spikes, then we can see that there's a consistent negative relationship between VIX innovations and foreigners' demand or foreigners' inflow adjusted by supply. And there's a consistent positive relationship between domestic demand and VIX innovations. This essentially illustrates our approach of trying to put it under an equilibrium system and use a consistent estimate of the price elasticity to speak to these type of stories. And finally, as promised, I just want to end my presentation by telling you something about China. So through the lens of a model, barring all of the assumptions about the structure of the treasury markets and so on, our estimate is basically that you multiply the multiplier that we estimate, which is 1, by the market share of China at this point is around 3.5%. So our estimate is basically that even if China sold off all its US treasuries, the price impact is around 60 basis points within a quarter. So roughly this is like 1.5 standard deviation of quarterly treasury price movement. So you can have a sense of whether this is large or this is small, but I just want to mention one thing, which is that if you want to have a sense of these type of calculations, you need to be very clear about how large is the relative market share of China relative to the entire market. The same calculation is going to be very different when we think about the role of China during 2010 versus 2025. Okay, so at this point, it looks like a small number, but back in 15 years ago, it might not be. All right. So let me just conclude here. I relatively quickly went through the models and the results, but overall, this paper is just to try to basically provide an attempt to construct an equilibrium pricing framework for the treasury market to be able to speak to the heterogeneities. And we hopefully provided some new insights into the demand for U.S. treasuries in terms of their countercyclicality, in terms of the structural changes, and in terms of the overall elasticities of the market. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for the attention. I look forward to joining this discussion.
Okay, so many thanks to Haolan's great presentation. So our discussion is going to be Professor Zhen Jiang from Northwestern University. Actually, Professor Jiang is also going to give us a talk on May 2nd. So the topic is also very interesting. It's on the monetary fiscal coordination with the international HKU. And we actually have two discussions for Zhen Yang's presentation. So one is from Yanxi Xie from he recently joined the Indiana University. Another discussion for Zhen Yang's paper on May 2nd is Sebastian Michael. He's currently working in UK. So now, without further ado, I'll let Zhen Yang to discuss Haolan's paper.
Okay, thank you, Ren. And I really want to thank the organizers for doing a great favor to our entire field. This is really great service. And also I want to thank them for inviting me to discuss this paper. I really enjoyed it. So actually, before I forget, I want to say something about the last picture Haonan showed us, which is about what if China sells all the treasury holdings. So if I understand the last slide correctly, this calculation is based on the market like the quantities of China's holding times this implied elasticity. So I just want to seek some clarification of whether that includes this secondary effect of some other foreigners looking at the treasury market. The treasury gets cheaper because of China's selling, and they want to substitute back into the treasury market. And if that is going to be accounted for in this calculation. So we can talk more about it. I just want to say it because I'll definitely forget about it later. Okay, so moving back to my discussion, I want to say that this paper studies obviously a very important question, which is about the pricing of the treasury. And there has been a really large literature here. We all want to understand what moves yields. So for example, here's a picture of the yield of 10-year treasury in the past 25 years. And the big story is that there's a low frequency movement, right? There's a secular decline in the interest rate level. And then after 2020, we embarked on this reversal where the US interest rate has been really high, even relative to other countries. And there's also very important cyclical behaviors. The interest rates tend to go down in bad times and tend to go up in good times, especially when that corresponds to some kind of Fed action like rate hikes or quantitative tightening. And growth also matters. Fiscal condition also seem to matter, especially recently. So the question is how to put down a quantitative framework for accounting for all these different types of movements. So the answer this paper puts forward is to change the question from what moves yields to who moves yields. So the idea is the following. It has two steps. The first one is, given that we can have a fairly comprehensive data on holdings, so we know how different agents rebalance their treasury portfolios. So we have information about their delta Q. And in the second step, we have market clearing. So that tells us how a given amount of delta Q translates to a given amount of delta P, the price change. So by doing that, the authors can attribute the price changes in the treasury market in different periods into the portfolio rebalancing or quantity changes of different investor categories. So for example, here, we can see that, I think this is a yield. We can see that the foreigners contributed to a lower yield pre-crisis because they were buying a lot. But after the crisis, they were more kind of silent, whereas the supply and the Fed policy were the dominant movers here. So in more detail, what the authors do is to look at this following equation for every type of investors. The idea is to explain the quantity change of each investor, so how much treasury they hold, based on the change in the price. So this gets you a sense of elasticity. So how are they going to adjust the portfolio when prices change? And then there are some additional idiosyncratic and common factors driving these investors' portfolio decisions. So one of the key findings in the paper is that the elasticities upon which investors adjust their portfolios as function of treasury price seems to be quite different. Households, which I think are largely hedge funds in this data, are largely responsive to price changes. Dealers are quite responsive, but in this sample, which is very interesting, rest of the world and Fed are not much. And the supply side, the Treasury is not very responsive, as we understand. Much of the supply decision is done by the Congress. And then the authors use this together with market clearing and general equilibrium to give us a sense of who moves the Treasury prices. There's also a very interesting kind of approach or methodology which uses the GMM to simultaneously estimate all the parameters. I think this is kind of an interesting extension to the standard GIV approach. So I highly recommend taking a look. It's very interesting, but I will not say too much about the methodology. I want to concentrate my discussion instead on this idea of connecting who moves yields to what moves yields. So the idea is, given we understand who is doing the trade and how the trade impacts the yields, I think there's also a natural question of why do these investors trade in the way they do? So I think that's a natural next step question to this already very well polished paper. So I think that would be also something for us as a whole in the field to think about. So my first 2 points are, I guess, connected. So let me go back to this equation, which says for this investor I, their quantity decision is a function of the price, some common factors, but this investor can have an individual specific loadings, lambda, and then there's some idiosyncratic or latent demand terms here. So the idea of identification is to jointly estimate all these parameters while assuming that this individual latent variable U is orthogonal in the cross-section of different investors. So the idea is to say these investors can rebalance the portfolios in different ways or for different reasons. We can have some macro drivers like monetary policy shocks or VIX. These things enter the common factors eta. And then again, the lambda, the loading can be different. So everything else that's unexplained by these macro drivers is idiosyncratic to this investor. And the assumption is that this is not correlated with other investors' idiosyncratic shocks. So I think that's a plausible approach. So that is something they are doing, kind of innovating on the front of using GMM for joint estimation. Back to the economic content, what I want to kind of think more about here is how exactly do certain macro drivers drive flows. Let's say the macro driver, like in some period, is an interest rate change. So the Fed decides to raise the interest rate. And then that should have two simultaneous effects through this equation. One is that the Fed rate or some other macro factors enters through the common factors, so the eta changes. And the other thing is because of this short rate change, we also expect the treasury prices to move, so delta P changes. And those two things would drive quantity decisions of different investors at the same time. So I think there's an interesting discussion or decomposition to be done here, because first there's a direct effect. If short rate goes up, the treasury yield goes up. So in any kind of traditional term structure models, that's something we always expect, we always want to see. And then what this demand system model additionally gives us is an indirect effect through investors rebalancing through their different elasticity of substitution. This should give us an additional effect on the discount rate or pricing of the treasury assets. So for example, if investors are responsive to the prices, then much of this is going to be driven by the idiosyncratic shocks. Whereas in the case where they're very responsive, then we may expect different amounts of price adjustments to these further quantity changes. So at this point, I think a nice way of pushing this literature forward is to get a closer connection to the more classical, term structure framework. And I think a different composition of the indirect and direct effect could be very helpful. So that's one of the things I want to bring up. The other thing I want to bring up is very much related to what Steve was asking, which is basically where is the cash flow? So again, I know this is a treasury context, but if you still like this government budget literature, you can still interpret this as a present value relationship. The treasury pricing is a function of the cash flows divided by the discount rates. And here the cash flows are things driven by fiscal or inflation or credit shocks. Whereas the way the investors substitute across assets, this is something we can think of as shocks to the discount rate, given the same cash flow. So the relevant question here is, I think most of the effects estimated through investor demand, that goes into the discount rate. But there is also a large amount of treasury price variations driven by the cash flow shocks. So I wonder, again, in the spirit of bringing this back to this standard finance valuation relationship, is there anything we can say meaningfully to connect to the demand system literature? So for example, is there an add-up relationship? How much do demand and quality shocks together contribute to the realized bond price movements? And I think that's another kind of interesting thing of evaluating whether knowing who balances portfolio is enough of understanding why the treasury prices move. So I think that's a first order question for all of us in this field. And I was kind of trying to get some thought on this particular question. So maybe here is a useful thought experiment. Curious to know if this makes sense at all. So I was thinking about some of the no-trade model, like Constantini Destafi. There's a whole set of heterogeneous agents. They're just happy with what they hold. So there's no trade, which simplifies things quite a bit. But there's still price adjustments, right? If you have a cash flow shock, you tell people the cash flow of the bond is going to change tomorrow. So today the price still changes, while the investors choose not to balance. But that doesn't mean that the cash flow doesn't change or the discount rate doesn't change. So I wonder if, because this is more concrete to think about, I wonder if the authors can do their kind of decomposition in a model like that, because I think that's a kind of a very simple and tractable model, and tell us how to think about these different components, cash flow, discount rate, rebalancing, in this framework. So I think that might be a way of interpreting, exactly what type of variation is driving identification and what type of variation is driving the decomposition results. I have two more quick comments. One is about the role of wealth. So for those of you who are kind of really tied to the literature, you notice there's a small difference. So in this paper, the authors directly model the quantity. So this is how much the people hold the treasuries. Whereas if you look at some of the other works, this is modeled using the portfolio share. And kind of the idea is that in conventional approaches, like the mean variance approach, we do care about portfolio share. The question is if it matters. I think that warrants some brief discussion. I think one issue here is to think about endogeneity of wealth, because basically the quantity is equal to the portfolio share times the wealth. So the question is, do you want to model wealth separately, or do you want to put wealth on the left-hand side? And my thought is that there's a difference between how customers selecting cereals in IO settings and how investors pick assets in finance settings, which I think is more exciting. And the reason is that for the latter setting, investor budget is endogenous. The agent holds treasury bonds. If treasury prices change, the agent's wealth would change, and that endogenously lead to a higher demand, even when their portfolio shares are constant. So that's, I think, something worth thinking about. And I would actually say that it's probably not a big change to the model if the authors explicitly tease out, the wealth component and the portfolio share component in this equation. So maybe that's something worth thinking about, given that I think this could solve this issue with Lucas' critique, right? What about stability in this parameter space? And maybe one can argue that by distinguishing between the wealth movements due to this endogenous revaluation effects and the active changes in portfolio choice, maybe this will give us more stable kind of parameters to think about the regime invariant quantities under the Lucas critique. My last comment is about long run versus short run and spot versus forward market. So this is about something we said in the beginning of the talk. Think about the swap trade. So here's something I learned from this quantitative tightening episode. The first thing is that after the QT, both in 2017 and 2022, you see that different types of investors have very different patterns of adjustment. So I called liquidity traders as broker-dealers, banks, and hedge funds. They are really absorbing a disproportionate amount of flows when the Fed sold or unwinded their treasury portfolio. Whereas the other bond investors were quite slow to adjust. So you can compare the red curve and blue curve. There's a very different speed of adjustment. So the natural question is whether we want to think about a horizon dependent in elasticity. If we enlarge the horizon, like from just one quarter, 1 year to a longer period, do we expect to have different conclusions about elasticities and how the markets adjust to quantity movements? And the other thing I think it would be useful to think about is the role played by the hedge fund, because they're very active in both cash and future markets. They're intermediating imbalances between the two markets by doing the basis trade. So for example, for the past few years, cash treasury is cheap, so high return. Future or some other swap derivatives are expensive, so low returns. So the hedge funds want to buy cash treasury and sell future treasuries. And the issue is when they got into trouble, like yesterday morning, literally, they had to unwind. And by unwinding, they have to sell their holdings of positive amounts of cash treasuries. So I think that would also be one of the explanation for what happened yesterday morning. And they're doing this at the level of trillions of dollars. So the relevant question here is, of course, one, why are they doing it? Who is on the other side of the futures market? And there are some recent research by Fed and other researchers. It seems that mutual funds are doing this on the other side because they are constrained by regulatory requirements. So doing the future trade is cheaper for them on their balance sheet than cash treasury. But now the natural question is, potentially think about an extended version of the demand equation. I understand that this might require more data and more instruments, but I just want to say that if you think about the hedge funds, which seem to play a big role here in this paper as well, maybe their demand function looks like something like a function of the price on the spot treasury market, and maybe the spread or the price of the future treasury market, and their incentive is really driven by both of them. So I think that's another thing worth incorporating as we get more data, as we get more sophisticated with demand estimation techniques. I think this cross-market arbitrage in the treasury market is very much worth thinking about. So maybe I'm afraid I'm a little bit out of time, but I want to say this is really exciting work. I like the methodological advance, and I also like the message in the paper. A natural next step is to map these quantities back to the economic primitives. And also in doing so, I also hope to see overall maybe next work a bit tighter connection to the standard, to the classical asset pricing framework, and that would really, I think, be a really good news for the entire demand system agenda. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks to Professor Zheng Yang's support to our seminar series and his great discussion. So now, Haonan, do you want to take a minute to respond to Professor Zheng Yang's discussion? And for the other audience, if you have any questions, also be prepared so we can have audiences to ask questions after Haonan's response.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Chen. I just want to say up front that I really appreciate Zheng's discussion. These are super deep points, and a lot of the points are super beneficial for us to think about the next steps. Not only the long run next steps, but also the immediate next steps. So just very quickly, following up on several points raised by Zheng. So the first point is about going back to the China counterfactual. So in our counterfactual, we do take into account the fact that because price changes, other investors are going to rebalance because they have downward sloping demand curves. Because we work under this combined equilibrium linear system, this 60 basis point do take into account this particular rebalancing of other investors, but it doesn't take into account the fact that potentially the sell-off of China's entire treasury portfolio is potentially going to change the elasticities associated with other investors. So to the extent that the overall market multipliers might be changing, potentially because of plumbing or liquidity type of issues, crowding of the market, you can think of this as some sort of like a lower bound estimate in that sense. And on Jiang's first point, I understand it is basically raising the question of whether we can say something about shifting the demand curves parallelly versus walking down the demand curves. This is definitely something that we can do. Basically, first step, shutting off the elasticities with respect to prices, just constructing some sort of counterfactuals only with respect to demand shifts, and then later adding on the downward sloping components. This is definitely something we can do. Second point is extremely deep, going to the distinction between cash flows and discount rates, and so we have to think about this in more detail. But I think in the continuity stuff, we kind of no trade kind of thought experiment. If we were to simulate a bunch of data from their model and use our methodology to estimate, there's not an immediate connection because essentially there's no quantity movements, so there's no way for us to sort of extract like an idiosyncratic demand shock. But you could imagine that if you just use certain type of methodology to request quantities and prices, you're going to get a relatively low demand elasticity. To what extent this is connected to the cash flow components, I have to think about it. And very quickly on the final 2 points, on the wealth front, exactly as you said, we could exploit the connection between wealth and the portfolio shares and the quantities. Basically, P times Q is equal to weight times wealth. So we can essentially transform this equation. In some sense, we're adding once you add one into the elasticities, that's roughly going to correspond to like the elasticities of portfolio weight with respect to prices. But we need to take care of the fact that the wealth now enter into the idiosyncratic shock components of investors. And the final point about futures and about futures, about short run and long run. We did some exercise in the paper trying to look at whether this price elasticity macro multiplier estimates is able to persist over the next several quarters. And we do find something that is potentially consistent with your finding in your paper, that initially the price impact seems to persist, but it sort of dies out after, let's say, 3 to 4 quarters, potentially when these more elastic investors step into the market. So that's something that we can flesh out a little bit clearer. And on the side of the treasury futures, I totally agree. I think ideally the flexibility of our approach allows us to essentially, to the extent we have data, we can add another market on top of the treasury market and do joint market clearing and use these cross-equation restrictions across different markets to construct additional instruments to identify these cross-elasticities. This is definitely something on the next step. More broadly, for instance, connecting the treasury market with the MBS market or the treasury market with the stock market. This is also something that can be done using our framework, although it's going to be a little bit taxing when it comes to data, but this is definitely something that can be done. I'll stop here. Thanks a lot.